Hi. This is Model Cycles from Elektron. It's a standalone FM and drum synthesis-based groovebox with a focus on knob per function control and simplified synthesis models. Elektron took a different approach here compared to its higher-end Digiton. Rather than give you free control over dozens of synth parameters, Model Cycles takes a more immediate and hands-on approach, giving you 6 FM machines with 4 unique parameters to control in each machine. Let's take a closer look. Before I dive into its synth options and machines, let's take a brief look at the hardware. Model Cycles is light and plastic, the build feels very solid, the knobs aren't wobbly at all, and the plastic is thick and strong. It has 6 velocity and pressure sensitive pads, 1 for each track, 16 step buttons called trig buttons here, or just trigs, which can also be used to play sounds chromatically. If you're familiar with Model Samples, its sample playing brother, this feels exactly the same, except it's gray and not white. Of the 6 FM machines, 5 are monophonic, and there's a 1 chord machine which is polyphonic. You can choose any one of the 6 machines for any one of the 6 tracks. So while each of the tracks is monophonic, meaning it can only play one sound at a time, if you make a track a chord track, then that sound can be a chord. Model Cycles has a small LCD screen that shows you the value of the parameter you're changing and does have some setup menus, but mostly it's knob per function with a parameter showing up here. If a knob or button has a secondary function, you access that by holding the function button and turning the knob or pressing the button. And these 3 buttons also serve as sort of shift functions for various things. So, for example, Retrig will retrigger a pad, track selects a track silently, and pattern selects patterns and banks of patterns. Model Cycles comes with a power supply, 2 adapters from 3.5mm MIDI to regular 5-pin MIDI. It also comes with a page of stickers. In terms of connectivity, Model Cycles sends MIDI over small 3.5mm MIDI jacks and thankfully supports both MIDI TRS-A and TRS-B, both on the input and on the output, so kudos to Elektron for that. Audio is sent both through 2 1/4-inch left and right outputs as well as an additional stereo headphone output. And like I mentioned, micro USB can be used for data sync and for using Model Cycles as an audio interface, feeding audio into your computer over USB. It cannot, however, be powered over USB, and the audio over USB is a single stereo feed rather than having an audio channel separately for each track. There are also 2 connectors on the side for a battery accessory, which hasn't been released at the time of the making of this video, but presumably is coming soon. So that's it for the hardware and overall connectivity. Let's dive into the meat of Model Cycles' sound, and that's its FM machines. I'll head into a empty pattern for this. Like I mentioned, Model Cycles has 6 FM machines and 6 tracks. You can load any one of the machines into any one of the tracks, and you do that by selecting a track and then hitting the drum button or the machine button. And the 6 machines are kick, snare, metal, percussion or perc, tone, and chord. Aside from the general sound design functions, each of the machine has 4 macro controls: sweep, contour, color, and shape, which control its characteristics. Now, they do different things based on the machine you're using, and we'll go through them in detail in a bit. But just for example, for the chord machine, color inverts the chord, shape selects the chord. Aside from the general sound design controls, Model Cycles also comes with a bunch of factory presets, and of course you can create your own. You access them in the preset menu, which is a shift function here, function shift. There are quite a few factory presets organized in different folders. So bass drum, for example. 80 options here, go up in the folder hierarchy, claps, 7 claps, cymbals, effects, hi-hats, percussion. Let's keep tasting these. Rim shots, snare drums, 62 of them, synth sounds, 200 of those. Obviously we won't listen to them all. Just a taste. And toms. I think that's it. Yep, so those are the factory categories and presets. You can load up one preset or sound per track, but Model Cycles, like other Elektron gear, also supports the concept of locks. You can load up 64 additional sounds, which can be called up on a per step basis for each pattern. Now, these are all just preset sounds, so once we pick one, let's just say, go for this one maybe, we can load it up and then, of course, go ahead and change it. Now, because this is a synth and not a sampler, these sounds transpose very well. Okay, let's dive in and take a deeper look at the 6 machines. Like I mentioned, they're all based on FM synthesis, but their controls are simplified and narrowed down to 4 parameters or macro parameters you can control, each time controlling a different aspect of FM synthesis. The idea is that rather than having to synthesize a kick, snare, or hi-hat yourself, you get these different starting points and take it from there. The 4 macro controls are labeled color, shape, sweep, and contour, but they do different things per machine. A default project loads up a different machine into each of the different tracks. You can load up chord tracks across the board or kick tracks. I'll start with tone machines. They're a simple 2-operator FM synth. At their core, FM synths are basic sine waves modulating or changing the frequency of other sine waves. A simple sine wave doesn't have any harmonics or any other additional frequencies beside the core frequency, but when you bring in a modulating sine wave to change its frequency, harmonics gradually get added. And the ratio between these 2 sine waves or between these 2 oscillators determines the character of the harmonics. The higher the ratio, the higher the harmonics, the lower, the bassier they get, all the way to that you just can almost tell the wobble. But the nice aspects of FM synthesis are, of course, at the higher rates. So for tone machines, color is the ratio, shape is the mod depth. Then sweep is feedback, which introduces noise into the equation. It starts out as additional harmonics, almost making a sawtooth waveform. But if you continue to crank this up, it'll gradually turn into noise. And then contour almost always is an envelope that's applied to the modulation depth. So here it's pretty snappy. This brings it in gradually. So this is how you sculpt your sound. More noise or less noise. Faster modulation or slower. And overall modulation depth and harmonic character. That, by the way, is FM synthesis in a nutshell. More complex FM synths just have more envelopes, more oscillators or operators, and potentially different types of oscillators, not just sine waves. Okay, let's move on to the next machine. Let's take a look at the Chord machine. The controls here are pretty simple. We mentioned this before. You've got dozens of chord types controlled by shape. You can control their inversions with color. And if I hold this, you can see me cycle through the different inversions. And aside from 4-note chords or 7th chords, you also have a few unison options, in which case color controls detune. So chords can also function as a nice detuned synth. Then sweep is sort of like a wavetable. Goes through different options with different harmonics. And contour is a filter. Filters out the higher frequencies. It's a low-pass filter. And it has an envelope as well. Let's move on. In the kick machine, color takes it from a sine wave to a square wave, again with more harmonics. Shape moves through a triangle waveform. Let's just hold this for a bit. With more harmonics, ultimately introducing noise. All of these are playable. Sweep is the characteristic pitch envelope. And contour creates a mod depth envelope for the shape and color. Sometimes subtle, but it makes this click right over here. And just this down there. I can increase the noise. So a lot to play with here. And while we're here, I might as well talk about punch, which does this. Gives a nice distorted accent. Let's move on to the snare machine. Color changes the color of the sound. I think it's just better to listen rather than talk about these in FM terms. And shape controls the balance between noise and the tone in the snare. And here too, sweep is a pitch envelope. And contour is an envelope for the modulation. Again from snappy. To longer. All of these, by the way, can be held. So they could be used as dirty tones if you want them to. Moving on, the metal machine is designed, as its name implies, for cymbals and hi-hats. This machine works at the higher pitch ranges. Here again, shape controls the mod depth. Better just to listen to them and hear what they do than think of them in FM synth terms. If I open up the gate, it'll be a bit clearer what's going on here. If an alien invasion starts next week, this broadcast may have caused it. These sounds do work better as short bursts of sound with a short decay rather than sustained notes. But the result is indeed very nice metallic percussive hits. Finally, the percussion machine, or Perc over here, is designed for tom-like sounds. But if we listen to it without a decay, we can investigate a little bit more what's going on here. Again, color controls harmonic relationships. Shape increases the modulation, adding more harmonics. Sweep again is a pitch envelope. And contour yet again controls the mod envelope, affecting the punchiness of the modulation. So those are the machines. Aside from the 6 machines and their 4 custom macro controls, there are a bunch of standard parameters that apply across the different tracks and machines. You can have them decay regardless of how long you hold the note, or have the gate stay open for as long as the note is held. You can control the length of the decay, overall pitch to transpose them. You've got 2 master effects, so you control the overall master effect parameters over here, reverb size and tone, and delay time and delay feedback, and then each track can have a different send to those master effects. The reverb here is delicious as can be expected from Elektron. Let's just take a listen to it. and it does go to infinity if you want it to. Or a bit less. And then the delays are again as per typical. Increase the delay send. And then delay time. And feedback is a function control. It does go over 100. It can get into dangerous territory. Below it will decay. Above it will intensify. Let's move on. Maybe take a listen to punch on this sound. Quite substantial. There's also volume control on a per track basis, which gets into distortion above 60. There's a single LFO per track. You can assign it to multiple parameters. Let's say assign it to the one that's probably easiest to hear, which is pitch. You can set its speed, either using the LFO control or determine overall speeds in the menu here in multiples. X means that it's tempo synced, and there's a whole range which isn't. You've got a few waveforms. Sine. This shape. Random or sample and hold. And then envelope will just run the LFO once. There are a few additional advanced LFO functions, like resetting it every time you press a button, fading it in or out, and controlling its phase. Swing, nudge, chance, and condition are pattern sequencing controls. We'll get to that in a bit. One last important sound design function in Model Cycles is in the pad menu, and that is the velocity destination. So velocity of the pads can be either fixed or just based on how hard you press, in which case you can assign a modulation destination for velocity aside from velocity, which obviously is an option. So let's say, for example, I can assign it to, let's go with reverb send. So let's crank this up. And obviously I need to choose a mod depth. Let's go all the way here. So now I'll turn down reverb send. When I hit a pad lightly, it doesn't get sent to the reverb. And the harder I hit it, the more it gets sent to the reverb. If I want a more extreme effect, I can adjust either the mod depth or the bass value. Let's maybe set it here. So this is the default reverb send, and then this is what happens when I hit it hard. And there are actually quite a few destinations here. You can see the light up when I pick a destination that's over here. So let's say, for example, volume or distortion. Or maybe, delay send. Same thing as reverb. A nice performance function that will be a bridge between sound design and sequencing is the retrig option. This lets you retrigger a pad when you hold the retrig button. Or if I enter the retrig menu, I could just have a pad retrigger automatically. Pads are pressure sensitive. I could set the retrig rate. And with that said, let's talk about sequencing. You can either step sequence or just play live using the onboard controls or an external keyboard. Each track has its own pattern. Each of these patterns can be up to 64 steps long, which you control in the page function. If you like, you can have each track have a different length, and then each track can also have a different speed scale. Step sequencing is pretty straightforward. You just hit the record button and you enter grid record mode. You choose the track that you want to play steps on and just put the steps where they need to be. Move a track, add those steps. Remember before I mentioned you can control the relative track scales. So for example, if I wanted the hi-hats to be triplets, add that option. This goes all the way to 1/8 of the core speed to double. And aside from step sequencing, you can just play live into a pattern. You do that by holding record and pressing play, and then record can either be quantized or unquantized. Let's live on the edge and record unquantized. So pretty simple stuff. Aside from recording notes, you can also automate parameters either on a step-by-step basis or by turning the knobs live. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to add a reverb to this step, plus increase its level. So let's put a reverb send here. Okay, so it only applies to this snare, not to this one. Similarly, if I wanted to create an automation live, just hit Shift Record. Let's say, go to my hat track and say Automate Color. By the way, if I enter grid recording, you'll notice that the steps that have automation on them blink, the steps that don't. If I go ahead and clear out this pattern just to show you a few more things, you can set ratchets on a per step basis. So if I hit Retrig, I could turn on ratchets for this step. This goes to pretty high rates, triplet rates. And I promised you we'd talk about these buttons. So swing, as you may have guessed, adds swing. And you can nudge notes on a per step basis. So this supports micro timing. Let's say I wanted to nudge this step forward to establish a custom groove. Chance is a simple parameter which lets you randomize whether a step will happen or not across the track. So here, there's a 73% chance that a specific trig will happen. And then aside from an overall chance parameter, you also have trig conditions, which let you set a condition on a per step or per trig basis. So let's talk about trig conditions or conditional trigs. I'll show this on kicks, maybe just program 4 kicks here. So there are a few options here. Let's say I wanted to apply trig conditions to this second kick. Just go into here. I can have it happen only when I press the fill button. So it doesn't happen now, but if I press fill, it will. There are a few other options, like having a trig happen only if a previous trig condition was true or false, whether a trigger on a neighboring track just happened or not, whether it's the first time a pattern plays or not, only a certain percentage of the times, and then various options for triggering a step once every several cycles. So that's percussion or drum style sequencing, which works very nicely here. You can also sequence tones and play the tones either live with live record or on a step-by-step basis. You could set fine-tune pitch with a pitch knob, but if you use the level data encoder, then you can set specific notes. It's a little bit tedious to sequence like this, but it's doable. And you can also set, not the easiest in the world to go step by step like this. If you have an external keyboard, obviously you can play live into it. And then you also have level or velocity control and length control on a per step basis. Of course, gate needs to be open for that. This is also how you go about automating chords. So if I wanted to place a chord trig over here, I could do that. And I could say go over here, change the chord to this, or transpose the root note. Then if I didn't like that inversion, I could change that as well. can't program chords using an external keyboard, at least not in this firmware version, so you have to sort of deal with the chord types and inversions using these two knobs. By the way, something I didn't mention before, you can tell which parameters are locked or changed on a per step basis by holding the step. These LEDs light up next to the parameters that are automated. So while I could go ahead and change all the parameters and substantially modify my sound on a per step basis, Model Cycles also supports the concept of preset locks, literally loading up a different preset into each step of a pattern. So let's say go into my snares, and let's say I wanted to load a different snare into here, go into my snares folder. You can preview a sound by pressing the button. Let's say I like this, so just select it. And I'll have that here. Let's maybe select a different sound here. So go for, preview's a bit of a hassle, but yeah, let's go like this. Oh. Hang on, didn't do it right. Yeah, let's go with this. Now, once I've locked those presets, if I go ahead and back out into the menu and go back into the preset menu and go into my locks, then now the snares that I picked appear as locks in the pattern, and you can have up to 64 of these on a per pattern basis. Aside from preset locks, Model Cycles supports the concept of machine locks, so you don't have to change a preset if you want to load up a different machine midway. Let's just program a few toms here, and then let's say I wanted to change this step to a different machine. Let's press this and say go into a chord machine. Okay, increase its level. Decay. Change the chord. All on a per step basis. Okay, let's talk about project scope. You can store 96 projects on the internal drive, or plus drive as it's called here. Each project can contain 96 patterns simultaneously in memory in 6 banks of 16 patterns each. So if I wanted to get out of bank C, move into bank A, load pattern 1, I could do that here. Play it, move on to the next pattern. Pattern 2 in bank A, move to bank B, play this pattern, say. Model Cycles, like its brother, doesn't have a song mode, but you can chain patterns. If you hold the pattern button, then press the first pattern, and while still holding it, press the second one, and then next one. Have that happen a few more times. You can see the pattern chain start to build up here, and play that. And it will skip through the patterns in sequence. Elektron is also offering software which lets you navigate the plus drive as well as transfer presets and rename them. You can also have each of the 6 tracks send out monophonic sequencing data over MIDI, either USB or 3.5mm MIDI. It doesn't have dedicated MIDI sequencing tracks. These are just notes that are sent out in parallel to whatever's playing on the machine itself. Before we move on to the pros and cons, just a few little tips, tricks, or ideas you can do with this. The first is that you can set a different rate for the retrigs on a per pad basis. So this is set to 16ths, but I can go ahead into here and say change this to retrig, say change this to maybe also retrig without pressing the retrig button. After a bit of messing around, retrigs could be quite an interesting performance option. Next up, the amp envelopes are pretty simple. You've got decay control, and then the gate can be either open or not, as long as you press the key, but there's no attack slope option here too. Set a long decay, I could have a chord hold, but I can't bring the sound in slowly. Luckily, a little hack, I also showed this in model samples. If we change the LFO to envelope mode, and then apply that to volume or distortion. Where are you? Here you are. And do it with a negative depth. By the way, you can change parameters fast by pressing the encoder and turning it, going into negative territory. I get a nice slow attack here. Maybe that's too slow. Let's do that for the chord too. Again, change the wave to envelope, slow it down, destination over here, and then, oops, negative. We have a slow attack. You can then fine tune the attack with the LFO speed knob. Another neat little trick, you can, let's say, automate variations in a hi-hat by recording those automations, so like that. But a simpler way is just to use an LFO and move it into sample and hold or random LFO, and then choose a depth, let's say. So this is our pattern before. Then just choose where we want to send the randomness to. Can be pitch, decay, which is a pretty cool option as well to get a nice groove. Now the nice thing about this, once we've created this sound, we can save it as a preset. So you don't need to keep automating your hi-hat every time to get this groove. Another neat little trick, still with hi-hats. If I've got this pattern, if I wanted to add an open hat alongside these closed hats, I could lock a preset, but the easiest way would be just to lock a decay. This saves you maybe creating another track with an open hat. Just put everything on one track, quickly alternate between open hats and closed hats. Next up, let's take a look at a few fun performance options. If I change a parameter, let's say, stick with hi-hats, say change their pitch. I've got 3 seconds to undo the value to its original value by pressing back. Another neat performance function is Control All. You hold track and you can change the pitch of all the tracks. Again, within 3 seconds, reset. And then another nice performance function. You've got a temporary save, which you can activate, then mess up stuff as much as you like with Control All. There's no undo for this, unfortunately, because we've messed up too many parameters. Just hit function reload. It goes back to normal. This won't affect the pattern as it is saved in your project. You can obviously save the pattern into the project with a long press on function temp save. This now becomes your bass. Let's say that you've found sort of an intermediate step that you like. Maybe this one. You could save that to temp save. Okay, mess things up. Go back to the temp save. And then if you wanted, go back to the original pattern with a long press on reload. Really nice multiple levels of undo here. The next few tips require a MIDI keyboard, which is something I do recommend you pair with Model Cycles if you get one. It is ultimately a great synth. The way that it works is you send it information on different MIDI channels to control different tracks. So if I set the key step to MIDI channel 1, I'll be triggering track 1, and you can change that in the settings, by the way. MIDI channel 2 is this, and MIDI channel 3, you guessed it, will trigger track 3. The one exception to this rule is the lowest notes on the keyboard. Here, each semitone up will trigger a different track. This is useful, say, if you want to sequence Model Cycles with an external sequencer. Now, the limitation you'll encounter if you connect an external keyboard to this is that you can only play one note at a time. If you try to play a chord, it won't work. Just one of the 2 notes will play. However, there is a trick to playing this polyphonically if you're able to obtain a device that will take notes from the keyboard and send them to different tracks for every new note you press. So I've got one of these here. It's MIDI Hub from Blocus. And there are a few other solutions. You can use Bohm's MIDI Translator Pro. That's software on a computer. And they also have a standalone box, the Bohm box. There's also a cable from RetroKits, the RK002. I haven't tried it, but it also works well. Regardless, what you need is something that will take the notes and round robin them through different tracks. And then you take the MIDI out of the key step and plug it into the out of your round robin device. And you will need another cable going into it and to the out of the key step. Now I've set this to take the MIDI coming out of the key step and round robin through channels 3, 4, 5, and 6. That way I can still use this for a beat. But notice now every new note that I press plays on a different track, cycles through the different tracks, and the result is I can now play chords. So you could round robin between any number of tracks and make this up to a 6-voice polyphonic synth. Of course, this does represent a sound design challenge because you need to change the sound on every single one of the tracks for it to apply well. So let's say if I wanted to have a maybe different color to the sound, if I didn't do it on all the tracks, it would sound odd. Luckily, there's Control-Alt to save the day. So you can design the sound any way you like, and it will play the same way across all the tracks. And you can keep changing the sound this way. Yeah, and this way Model Cycles can be a truly polyphonic synth. By the way, if you want the notes to hold when you're playing a chord, make sure the gate is open across all 4 tracks. Okay, let's talk about some pros and cons. From a user interface perspective, if you look at Model Cycles as a drum synth, the interface is excellent. However, if you want to use it as an FM synth to program melodic patterns, it might make sense to use an external MIDI keyboard to do that. I think Model Cycles could have really benefited from a piano-style layout like the Digiton or Analog 4, with an immediate option to shift octaves up and down. As it stands now, it plays chromatically, so it's hard to play a scale, not impossible, but you need to get used to it. If you want to transpose this, it's sort of a lengthy process of going into shift and track, hitting keyboard transpose, and then if you've learned where the notes are, you'd want to transpose an octave up or down, which takes a few steps and is hard to do precisely. Hopefully in the future we'll see a firmware update where you can set scales for these trigs, so you can play 2 octaves very easily, first here and a second here, and some way to transpose octaves quickly without getting into this menu. Regarding the pads, I'm not a professional finger drummer. My personal opinion is that they're too hard. I typically use them in fixed velocity mode, though of course it's great that that feature is in here, right? So it's nice that they're velocity sensitive, it's nice that they're pressure sensitive as well. But if you're expecting a finger drumming experience, make sure you try them in store or with a friend to see that it suits your style. Aside from that, I have 2 nitpicky cons, again, which hopefully will be fixed in a firmware update. The first is that you can't send the delay into the reverb. So say I've got this hi-hat, sent it to the reverb, and I turn on delays for it. The delays aren't actually sent into the reverb as well. Again, hopefully a future firmware update will allow for a send from the delays into the reverb. Then a second nitpicky comment is that the presets aren't level matched. So you could be scrolling across them and have one that's really loud, another that's relatively soft. This is regardless, by the way, if velocity is fixed or not. Just some of them are pretty loud, others aren't. You can, of course, fix that immediately once you load a preset with the independent volume on a per track basis. It would be just nice if the presets were level matched. While we're on feature requests, it would be nice if you could use an external keyboard to program chords rather than using the shape option. And finally, on the con side, or pros depending on how you look at it, this isn't a traditional FM synth if you're looking for direct access to algorithms and programming detailed in specific envelopes with all the custom controls you're used to seeing on Digiton or other FM synths. You don't have that for the most part. That said, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing within the scope of this instrument. On the pros side, the sound engine is fantastic and the machines are extremely versatile. Programming a ringing cymbal or metallic tom isn't exactly a walk in the park on a regular FM synth, and Model Cycles makes getting a broad range of controllable FM sounds a breeze. Elektron's Digatone did a lot to simplify FM synthesis, and this takes that simplification quite a few steps farther, and I mean that in a very good way. Sure, if you want flexibility, then Digatone is still the one to beat. But if you want a standalone FM and drum synth with easy access to a broad range of FM machines and algorithms alongside fantastic sequencing, this is as good as it gets, and its price is fairly competitive. If you'd like plenty more ideas on what to do with LFOs, envelopes, mod destinations, FM synthesis, and more, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support the work done on this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.